Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jagannath Panda. I'm based in Stockholm. I'm the head of the Stockholm Indo-Pacific Center at the Institute for Security and Development Policy. We are an independent think tank, policy think tank, focusing a lot on larger Asian issues. Um, um, I must welcome on behalf of ISDP for this first webinar in the series on China's Himalayan hustle. This is a part of the Indo-Pacific Center's project on the trying to understand the Chinese activities and strategies in the Himalayan Valley. And we'll be carrying out a number of webinars in the series. And this is first in the series. And we have a terrific panel to discuss about China's Himalayan hustle, and particularly to discuss about the Chinese strategy in terms of infrastructural hegemony. In order to discuss this, we have assembled a fine set of scholars who have researched about China, and particularly they have tracked out the Chinese foreign policy issues, security strategy, and defense issues for a number of years. And the idea of this project is to identify how the West and India could collaborate together, along with some of the Himalayan neighbors in the regions, in order to put a check on the China's revisionist strategy. And I think all of you would agree with me that it's been sometimes, I think, China-India boundary dispute has been in the news. But we have not really covered in length trying to understand the Chinese strategy in the Himalayan regions, which is actually making a steady progress. My interactions with many China specialists is that I think China's Himalayan strategy is something that the West and India should look and discuss it in together. Of course, China's Himalayan strategy is nothing singular in nature. I would rather call it a trans-Himalayan strategy, because when we are talking about China's Himalayan strategy, it is actually linked with a number of issues in the regions. It covers economic investment, political backing, personal diplomacy, and with quasi-military, quasi-diplomatic involvement. It involves soft power diplomacy along with a hard power diplomacy. And most interestingly, it has also technological dimension, tech diplomacy that the Chinese are bringing to its trans-Himalayan strategy. In order to discuss this, we have a terrific panel. We have Mathis Simalik. He's the executive director of the Central European Institute of Asian Studies, which is a think tank focusing on Asian issues and on East Asian issues, covering the foreign policy and security issues. And Mathis is a China specialist. He covers the China and East Asian issues at length. We have also Mr. Jeffrey Payne. He's currently a faculty at the Near East South Asia Center in the Strategic Studies in the Washington, D.C. NESA is a think tank which covers the South Asian affairs and the East Asian issues, covering the security and foreign policy issues. Then we have Dr. Thomas Eder. He is a senior researcher on China. He covered China's foreign policy and security policy from the Austrian Institute for International Affairs based in Vienna. Then we have Dr. Antonina. She is a Fulbright senior scholar at Indiana University from Bloomington in the United States. But most interestingly, she is teaching as a faculty at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. And she is the founding director of the Taiwan Lab Research Center in Krakow. Then we have, from the region itself, from Nepal, but he is based in University of Warsaw, Mr. Saroj Kumar Aryan. He's a researcher, a senior faculty member at the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Warsaw. He's covering China and South Asian issues, particularly China's relations with Nepal for some time. So welcome you, all of you, to this panel and to this panel discussion, to this webinar today. We have a number of people joining from different parts of the globe today. Welcome all of you, wherever you are based in. And I think we'll keep this webinar for 1.5 hours particularly. So I'll start with a little bit of a short introduction that, as I mentioned earlier, that we have covered in length about China-India boundary dispute. In fact, many international media, think tanks, they write very frequently about China-India boundary dispute. In fact, after I have moved to Europe for last 2.5 years, I see that many European think tanks, including some of the prominent US think tanks, they cover quite frequently about China-India boundary dispute. But when it comes to China's Himalayan Valley and about its strategy, about its policies, nothing much has been written. And there is this huge gap about, how the US, how the West and the European communities should talk to the countries in the regions who are suffering, particularly India and some of the Himalayan neighbors, who are actually facing so much difficulties from the Chinese hegemony. We have talked in length also about China's strategy in the Indian Ocean regions, particularly factoring the Indo-Pacific partnerships that we are building, that EU is a part today in the Indo-Pacific regions. Particularly, India is building these complementarity with the Quad countries, particularly with the US, Japan, Australia, and many other countries in the region. But again, I think when it comes to the Himalayan regions, we don't discuss it in length, that to what extent the Chinese are actually trying to change the status quo in the regions, and how China's broader game plan is linked with its Himalayan strategy. To start with, maybe I'll maybe welcome Matis to start and share his comments. How do you really see China's Himalayan strategy? How do you really explain it in terms of China's foreign policy and China's neighborhood strategy? And what are the lessons that probably the international community, and what are the lessons are there for the EU or the West and India should draw in terms of understanding the China's Himalayan strategy or the Trans-Himalayan strategy? How do you really see that the future looks like, and whether there is a scope for EU and India to collaborate on some of these issues that I mentioned? We'll start with you, and then we'll come to Jeff, and then Thomas, and then Antonin, and then Soroj. Maybe first you, Matheus, 6 to 7 minutes. Welcome to you.
Thank you, Jagannath, and thanks for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to talk at this event today here. Since I'm the first one and I have 6 to 7 minutes, I will try to be as efficient as possible and set the scene, first of all, for what we are going to be discussing today. Of course, I think it doesn't really need to be stressed that the Himalayan region is of a high strategic importance for China. If it were not, we would not be talking about it today. China itself has considerable interest in the region, given the fact that it itself is a Himalayan country. When we look at this from the perspective of China controlling Tibet, which China itself deems to be one of the core interest issues. So the issues which are of utmost importance for the Chinese Communist Party, and its ability to survive as the leading political force within mainland China. So this is, of course, the first sort of point that needs to be recognized, that a lot of China's interests with regards to the Himalayan region are informed by the Tibet issue. Then, of course, since this is a peripheral region for China, it also has interest when it comes to interacting with the other countries located at China's border, which in actuality is a border that still has a lot of unresolved territorial issues, and we see them flare up from time to time, again and again. Just with India, we have two areas where the border is being disputed, and we've seen skirmishes not so long ago on the more western side of the border in the Aksai Chin, and of course on the eastern side in the Arunachal Pradesh. In Aksai Chin, we've seen a lot of these border skirmishes in 2020-2021 time frame, which actually resulted in India losing effective control over some of the areas that were under India's control until the border skirmishes occurred. This is, of course, not the only a problem just for India. We've seen land grabs in Bhutan recently, which is, of course, also an issue that warrants international attention, given that these types of unilateral land grabs, even if these are disputed territories, are significantly undermining the rules-based global order, which has respect for sovereignty as one of the key pillars, and which even rhetorically China posits as a key component of its foreign policy. Of course, how China approaches the region is not just based on these sort of territorial issues and military skirmishes. Jagannath, you have also already alluded to it, that it has a significant component of economic cooperation with the countries in the region, especially when it comes to Nepal, where China is very active economically. Since 2019, Nepal has had a strategic partnership with China, which has in turn translated in announcement of a lot of new economic projects, be it your traditional investments or various forms of infrastructure projects, such as the Trans-Himalayan multidimensional connectivity network. Very long title for what translates into infrastructure projects in the railway sectors, communication networks, etc., which of course warrants questions on what kinds of impacts this type of economic exposure of the Himalayan countries to China will have, not just on their ability to withstand potential Chinese pressures, but also on the domestic governance issues within China. Oftentimes, pundits would raise the issue of debt traps when it's come to this, but that's too simplistic of a narrative when we are looking at these issues. So maybe it would be more valuable to look at what were the experiences of other countries with similar types of projects around the world. Coming from Central Europe, let's me maybe allude to some of our experiences here, which show not just what are the problems with this type of economic activities, but also show that China as an actor is also evolving in its approach and ability to deliver various types of economic projects. If we go back to the year 2011, we've had the very illustrative experience in Poland, and maybe Antonina will follow up on this later. But there was this experience in Poland with the construction of a highway by a Chinese company, Coveco, which actually disappeared midway through construction because it just had such poor budgeting for the project and has undercut the prices when it was making its tender offer and was unable to deliver this project. Fast forward to nowadays, where we have had recently a successful implementation of the Pelishev's Bridge project by a Chinese company in Croatia, which was also at the same time the very first Chinese infrastructure project funded by EU funds. And this project was actually implemented successfully by China. The bridge is standing, is operational. It's of strategic importance to Croatia as it connects two pieces of the landmass that are disrupted by a piece of Bosnian territory. But it doesn't mean that this project is without issues either, right? It's a project of strategic importance, which raises security questions of what kind of security impacts China's involvement in the construction can have. Just because it's a highway, it doesn't mean that there are not some sensitive issues. We might imagine highways as a static piece of concrete, but when it comes to actually operation of highways and highway bridges, there's also a lot of technology and communication networks that go in place. So this is something to consider. And there was also the issue with how the project was actually procured, and it kind of unveiled the problem that we now understand a little bit better, and that is impact of domestic subsidies within China on competitiveness of Chinese companies abroad, and pushing out of local competitors from tenders. And as a result of that, the EU has adopted its regulation on foreign subsidies. These are, of course, not the only two projects that we had experience with. Quite illustrative would be the highway project in Montenegro that Montenegrin government tried to finance, firstly from European funds and World Bank funds, but both institutions deemed the project unsustainable, and as a result, or in a sort of follow-up, Montenegro jumped on the opportunity to have the project financed by China despite the unsustainability issues, which actually manifested during the COVID pandemic, where Montenegro government was faced with income issues due to drop in travel, drop in tourism, which was a main source of revenues for the Montenegro government, and the Montenegro government found itself in a difficult spot of repaying the loans that went into the project. There are also other issues, not just financial ones, such as environmental degradation during the construction by Chinese companies involved in the project, which actually resulted in complete destruction of a UNESCO World Heritage Site that is beyond repair at this point. Budapest-Belgrade Railway is another project that is often mentioned, especially due to its very non-transparent nature, but also over large involvement of domestic oligarchy in Hungary and domestic corrupt networks, which also showcases how China can benefit from the existing governance gaps in the countries and domestic cleavages, pre-existing illicit networks as vectors through which they can operate these types of projects. On one hand, it provides China with an ability to kind of insert its own influence into these networks, but on the other hand, it's also an issue of China just going with the flow of what is the situation in that country, and using that to be even able to enter the market. Let's maybe move on to the third issue that I would like to talk in a few more minutes, and that is how to respond to the challenges posed by China and Chinese infrastructure projects, investment projects in the Himalayan region, and what role can EU play there. As we all know, EU has responded to Chinese investment and infrastructure push globally with unveiling of the Global Gateway initiative. Of course, it's still not very clear of how all of these projects are going to be implemented under the Global Gateway initiative, but it's a point of departure that we have to consider. And as a project, it also may lead to potential cooperation with Indian partners, Indian development activities in the region, as India would be the actor who has a better regional understanding compared to maybe European companies involved in the Global Gateway initiative. Already, when we look at the Global Gateway databases, we see that there are two projects being approved or implemented in India, two projects in Nepal, but they are not really dealing with the hardcore infrastructure needs of the countries. In Nepal, we have projects related to green recovery of Nepal post-COVID-19 pandemic, projects related to developing of school infrastructure, which are of course all very necessary, but they don't necessarily address the infrastructure needs of these countries. And this is something that EU has to deal with moving forward, how to address the actual infrastructure needs for roads, for railways, for power plants, etc., in the target countries where these are the types of projects that China has been typically going after and financing. And yes, it's very necessary to finance the soft projects as well, but increasingly this is going to be an issue of how are we going to compete with China in externally in being a development actor when we have sort of withdrawn from financing of this real infrastructure project. So I'll pause here because I think I've used up my allocated time, and hopefully we can go deeper on all of these points at a later point.
No, thank you very much. I think those are interesting comment to start with, and I think your case about Montenegro is very interesting. And I think this is where most of the neighboring countries in the Himalayan Valley, they should take a strong note, particularly Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. They should take a note of this Chinese economic investment strategy, trying to empower a particular country, but eventually trying to make them to stay dependent on China. We'll come back to you, Matej, but maybe I'll take this opportunity to invite Jeffrey. Jeffrey, how do you really think, what's the debate in the Washington DC circuit about the recent current Chinese activities in the Himalayan valleys? Of course, there is boundary dispute with India, but we are not really covering or concerned about the boundary dispute because that's a bilateral dispute that China is having with India. That's a dispute India would like to tackle on its own. How to pose a militaristic challenge to China. But then when it comes to the Himalayan Valley, there are a host number of issues from ecological degradation to the militarization of the valleys, trying to encroach, economic influence on the neighbors. How do you really see US and India could work on this together? And what are your take about the current Chinese strategy in terms of looking at their future planning?
Well, thank you, Dr. Panda, for hosting me. It's a pleasure. Forgive me. I have a very weak signal right now in Delhi, and I'm fighting off a cold. So forgive all of you watching if I don't come in as crystal clear as I could. Also, before I start, my remarks here are my own. They don't represent NISA or the National Defense University or the larger U.S. government, of which my institution is affiliated. But diving into the kind of subjects at hand, and I know my fellow panelists will probably, I think there'll be a lot of commonality, and I think they will have, in a lot of ways, more interesting evidence to rely on than I will. So I will kind of approach it, like you said, Dr. Panda, from a DC mindset. So what do we make of the Himalayan policy by China, by Beijing? It's a continuation of something that is domestically driven within China. It's part of the grand bargain that the CCP has made about making sure that China takes its rightful place as Asia's hegemon. This is obviously much more tracked and much more discussed as it relates to the Western Pacific, but it's true throughout Central Asia, and certainly in the Himalaya Valley, in the Himalaya region at large. And it's tied to, as our previous panelists talked about, various economic considerations, various domestic drivers, and also signals. I think one of the aspects that DC finds particularly interesting in the way that tensions between India and China on the border dispute, and kind of the subsequent collapse of political bilateral relations since those disputes, is the kind of threat assessment that Beijing signals vis-a-vis Delhi. That in Delhi, I think the assessment is that they are another great power of Asia, and these are two major actors that are standing afoot of each other, and this is problematic. Beijing, at least in the way it publicly signals things, does not see India as a peer. It does not have the power, the reach, the scale, or the assets to bring to bear. And so therefore it's more of an annoyance again, some of this is signaling, but it's interesting to see the narrative and how it plays out of Beijing, and it's something that Washington discusses pretty regularly. Of the striking features of this question of China's presence in the Himalayas and how the other states and other engaged stakeholders in the region have responded, is essentially the duality of China's adventurism in its foreign policy. It is aggressive, and it's clearly aggressive, and you see this with the clashes with the Indian army in the Himalaya disputed zones. You see this in some of the wolf warrior diplomacy towards Nepal and other regional states, Bhutan, and even other states that comment about what's happening in the Himalayas. But at the same time, they do it very gradually, and doing it in a very like sunset scale of vision, or even opaque if they can help it. So when everyone else is distracted, that's when they move, because they don't want the attention to be on this. And a second related to that is, and my previous commenter very, very effectively brought this up, is the issue of sovereignty, and that while China's moves in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea vis-a-vis the Senkakus are much, they have many more dominoes associated with them, with essentially the grab or the redefinition of maritime territory, and kind of the eradication of what UNCLOS is built upon, if successful. They're doing a similar process here. Essentially get the world comfortable that they control these regions, and then as a result, it becomes by default theirs. So it's a way of kind of gradually eroding and exhausting those who would oppose or object or seek to draw attention to it. Just wear everyone out, and know that you probably have more resources than anyone that is an immediate neighbor could levy against you to push back. But bringing into the final segment, what could the U.S. do vis-a-vis the region and its bilateral relationship with India? Dr. Panda, I think your initial comments represent a lot of how the U.S. approaches it, and that is through the bilateral relationship. And it will be led and driven and paced by India, and the degree in which India looks for outside support and requests outside support. And that's very much a hallmark of the relationship between Delhi and Washington. It's often talked about in relation to the Quad, but really much of the progress in the relationship has been bilaterally. And so I think this gets to a larger issue if you expand it to Nepal and Bhutan and even Bangladesh and others that would be worried and wary of what's happening, is, as Assistant Secretary Campbell said yesterday at the Stimson Center, that U.S. policies, and we've learned the lesson, so to speak, of the paternalistic listening to the Indo-Pacific. Now it is really a partnership that is driven by the partners. So the requests are there. So this was related to India, but also relates to Nepal. So what Nepal requests and what is within the realm of possibility that the U.S. could provide. And so it's a lot about the alignment that's there, but these conversations happen continuously and routinely, both in the public and in the track one government to government level. And then the final thing I will bring up is the one thing that is that the U.S. talks about a lot vis-a-vis this is it's a very negative indication of a larger process of misinformation that is associated with China's foreign policy adventurism. China has been very effective at kind of gaining cred in the street, both in South Asia, Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, and North, South America, Europe, the whole world, where the kind of they create a narrative that is either clouds the situation or distracts from the situation. And it's hard for, say, a country like Nepal, and certainly a country like India, who's a party to this, to break through that kind of wall of misinformation. It becomes everyone's throwing mud at each other versus no one party is blatantly violating established rules and creating aggression and raising the temperature, and another is responding to that. Instead, it's no, it's everyone's in the playpen and everyone's throwing mud. And so why care? Everyone's the same. So that's something that I think no party has figured out, but it's something that the U.S. is navigating for its own global policy and how to treat that. So I'll end there and thank you again for the invitation.
No, thank you. Those are interesting remarks. In fact, your point about to what extent India must require for outside support, that is one aspect. I think US would look towards India before committing or trying to collaborate anything with India. But at the bilateral sphere, I think you pointed out about the immediate response is the bilateral relationship. But I think at the bilateral level, already there have been a lot of discussion about some of these issues, if not particularly on the boundary dispute, but also but in general about the Himalayan issues, about the neighborhood issues at the bilateral level between India and US in the 2.2 dialogue to many other level of dialogues. These issues has been discussed, and those are positive developments. Definitely, given the fact that there is a synergy, strategic synergy is emerging, and we must welcome. But I'll come back to you with more pointed remarks on some of these issues. That when it comes to the militarization of the regions, when it comes to the technological upgradation that the Chinese are doing, how India and US could possibly counter. Maybe we'll come back to you for the second round. Thomas, maybe 6 to 7 minutes now belongs to you. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jagannath, for the invitation. Pleasure to talk to you and colleagues. So let's start with China's neighborhood policy and the Himalayan region, and I'll make 3 points here. So the first one, China seeks to and has its closest security partners in its neighborhood, North Korea, Russia, and Pakistan, which brings us to the Himalayan region. Pakistan is certainly a very important security partner for China and its designs for the region. Doesn't have a great number of security partners, making it even more important. It's a key importer of Chinese weapons and to conduct joint military exercises, and some of the Chinese-built infrastructure or invested infrastructure in Pakistan has been debated as potentially dual use, for example, Port of Gwadar. Pakistan is certainly a key target for Chinese infrastructure loans and investments that have been mentioned in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. China-Pakistan Economic Corridor has absorbed a lot of energy, transport, and to a lesser degree, digital infrastructure projects. And a lot of what explains there's a lot of China's neighborhood policy is about security, is about securing its periphery, including Tibet and Xinjiang, but now also about finding partners for China's competition with the US. And both these types of efforts lead to the listed security partners. Now, a second point I want to make here is that China tries to envelop also the Himalayan region in its mini and multilateral initiatives, co-initiated, co-leads. First and foremost, that's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, where India and Pakistan joined in 2017, and Nepal is a dialogue partner, might become an observer or even member. As for the BRICS group, of course, India is a member, and lastly, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, all India, Pakistan, and Nepal are members. Now, third point, what China doesn't have here in the Himalayan region is a regional grouping like China's C+5 with the Central Asian states. That wasn't an option, hasn't perhaps been particularly pursued. And it doesn't have an interaction with a regional grouping like the ASEAN plus China meetings it has in Southeast Asia. Overall, the region is certainly important to China, but not as important as the Western Pacific. Now, getting to China's infrastructure push itself, I would again like to raise 3 points or dimensions. So this is firstly about connecting the Himalayan region within China by Tibet and partly Xinjiang much more intimately with the coastal and central regions of China. There's an infrastructure push involving a lot of construction and upgrades regarding to airports, heliports, also roads and railways, and in addition to the first very famous railway into Tibet from Qinghai, the second one from Sichuan is being built right now. It should be the plan is to have it ready 2030 or soon after. The second dimension is connecting remote areas within China's Himalayan regions, or within Tibet and Xinjiang, much more with central infrastructural nodes within these regions, so to make also the very border areas within these regions better accessible. And the third dimension is that China also prepares for trans-Himalayan connections, notably to Nepal. So this much on infrastructure, and now lastly about EU-India cooperation. Now, generally, when it comes to India's security, I think France is increasingly relevant. Maybe not as relevant as other actors, but relevant. This has been a natural progression driven by internal motivations on both sides. India, as a state living in peace in South Asia, has increasingly bought French arms. Of course, not as many as from Russia. France has also been very interested in cooperating on security issues more broadly with India, also in the Indian Ocean region. Another point here, in a certainly contested information environment in the Himalayan region, transparency is important and difficult to achieve. And in these very remote areas, India certainly already has several means of delivering transparency using satellite navigation systems and publishing results, but can also profit in a complementary fashion, perhaps, from using the EU's Galileo system. Third point, and this has already been talked about by Mate, the Global Gateway Infrastructure program of the EU. Certainly there could be joint transport infrastructure projects, mostly roads, perhaps, in the future that could lead to better connections between the center and border regions in India. And lastly, on a diplomatic and multilateral level, I think both the EU and India should jointly push for greater respect for the Charter of the United Nations globally. I think particularly the prohibition of force has been increasingly disregarded, which is an exceedingly dangerous development. And it should be clear here and everywhere that eyes are fixed on border areas, and it should be clear that the United Nations Charter only allows for self-defense in case of an armed attack. It should be clear that measures taken in self-defense remain bound by the UN Charter and the laws of war. And simply inventing an armed attack by another side will not be tolerated, nor will an entirely disproportional response, and that severe violations of the UN Charter will have severe consequences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Very interesting observation. In fact, I do agree with you. I think UN, your point about India, EU should look together to a forum like UN, which talks about prohibition of forces. That is an interesting observation. I think we need a little more deliberation between India and EU, how to really expedite collaborations in terms of peacemaking and peacekeeping in the regions, subject to if something is going wrong, given the China's military activism in the regions, given the fact that the way China has behaved towards India over the last 4 or 5 years. In fact, we had the Galwan incident happening during the pandemic, which was really unexpected. So whether UN could be a platform, and whether India and EU could actually collaborate to raise some of these issues internationally in order to create that pressure zone on China. And I think that's a point I would take from your remarks particularly. But your point about global gateway to France as a relevant partner, and many other countries could be possibly be talking about how EU-India collaborations could happen in terms of checking China's revisionism ideas in the Himalayan regions are well taken, and I'll come back to you in the next round. Antonina, I know you have been covering and you have written about some of these issues more particularly, not only from China's point of view, but also from the Taiwan's point of view. You have written how the Chinese are actually looking at the Taiwan issues and how they are trying to change the status quo in the cross-strait regions. So how do you really visualize staying from in this region? How do you really visualize where do EU and India could come together in terms of raising that necessary awareness, maybe in the EU Parliament, in a multilateral venue, as Thomas raised, that UN could be one of the venues. But more than that, how do you really read the Chinese strategy in terms of current strategy and in terms of the future strategy? Where do you really see EU and India could have that complementarity? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Jagannath, and thank you again for inviting me to this wonderful and very much needed workshop. So let me start with China's perspective and China's strategy. Indeed, we can observe some sort of Himalayan cha-cha. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Think about 2017 and the Doklam crisis, right? So the Chinese started to expand the road. Then we had this standoff at the border. Well, everything got kind of smooth, you know, and the troops were withdrawn, but still we did have a certain step taken, right? Plus, of course, China is building some sort of artificial villages in the border areas. And we've already mentioned it. It is a kind of drop-by-drop erosion, right? So making us all used to the fact that these territories are Chinese. So by default, they belong to the Chinese state and should be in control of Beijing. But interestingly, this does not have to be the case. We are kind of now taking it for granted that China is so aggressive, provocative, that it's so expansionist. But think about the 1950s, right? There was a very clear, reportedly, proposal given from the Chinese government to India about swapping, right? So about the kind of status quo agreement, like let's agree that Arunachal Pradesh is part, not Arunachal Pradesh at that time. At that time it was still called Nepal, right? But this is the same territory we are talking about. So let's just simplify to make our lives less complicated. So the idea was, let's accept Arunachal Pradesh is a part of India, and let's make India recognize Aksai Chin, right, the part of historical Kashmir, as a part of Chinese territory. And reportedly, this proposal was actually repeated by Deng Xiaoping, right, in the 1980s, late 1970s, early 1980s. So we can see that China used to be more, less aggressive, let's say. So there were some small windows of opportunities. For some reason, India did not accept them. But of course, China is in a very different position these days, right? So we pretty much cannot turn the clock back to the 1950s, unlike Deng Xiaoping and Rajiv Gandhi used to tell us in 1988, right? They also wanted to turn the clock back to the 1950s, but we can clearly see that it's not really possible. But we did have some very important gestures, again, in a different era, more than 10 years ago, when, for example, the Natula border crossing was opened for both cross-border trade as well as for pilgrimage movements. And let us not forget, Natula is, also a part of, it's a part of Sikkim, right? So you can see that in a way, China de facto acknowledged that Sikkim is a part of Indian territory, right? So we can see that that kind of nice, peaceful gestures are possible. Still, we have to remember that China-India border conflict is like a microcosm of China-India relations, right? So if China-India relations per se are going into the right direction, border situation also gets kind of smoothed a little bit, right? So it calms down. And the other way around too, right? So if we have a skirmish, it really impacts negatively on all other aspects of China-India relations. Again, we can clearly see that the so-called 1988 breakthrough does not really work out in practice. We cannot separate the border issue from all other aspects of China-India relations. Another point I wanted to make is in reference to what Jeffrey already said, so about this tightening India-US friendship or partnership. It's officially not an alliance, but if we look at the number and content of certain agreements between India and the US, signed particularly during the Narendra Modi era, we can see that it has a lot to do with an alliance, pretty much, including data sharing, for instance. Moreover, last year, US Senate introduced a resolution in which it reaffirmed that Arunachal Pradesh is not a disputed territory, but is actually an integral part of India. In this resolution, in this draft, we can read that the US has recognized the McMahon line since 1962. So now it only reaffirms that Arunachal Pradesh is an integral part of Indian territory. So there was a lot of buzz and hype across Indian media last year, even though it was pretty much just a reaffirmation. It was nothing new. Moreover, this year, just a few months ago, the US Department of State reaffirmed again that Arunachal Pradesh is a part of Indian territory, which of course, prompted the Chinese side to react in a very, very negative, angry way, as you can imagine. So that leads me to the third and the last part of this, my short comment. So what India is doing and what India can do. So we can clearly see that India is betting on the US, just like US is betting on India. So, you know, one cannot go without the other when it comes to the China challenge in the region. And as I've already mentioned, data sharing is a very important element of this cooperation. It's not just about, you know, seeing how the troops are moving or what kind of infrastructural projects China is doing. It's also about water data sharing, for instance. And I think it was already mentioned that these problems include environmental issues, right? Pollution and all projects which China has been carrying out independently on its own. And this includes water diversion, water projects on Brahmaputra, which is a transboundary river. And here we have a kind of combo, a double problem, because part of Brahmaputra goes through Arunachal Pradesh. And let us not forget that Arunachal Pradesh is, from Beijing's point of view, a disputed area. Plus, we have a water issue, right? China is an upper stream country. India is in comparison or in relation to China, downstream country, so in a much more difficult position because China is free to divert water, erect river dams, and so on and so forth, right? Negatively impacting the water flow down to India. And as you can guess, transportation system, agricultural activities, and so on and so forth, even electricity production as well, because India has its own power plants, has its own dams, which work as power plants as well. So in the times of global climate change, droughts, and sudden terrible rainfalls and floods, we can see that it can have tremendous consequences. And we did see that already in 2017, China did not share water data with India, did not warn India about the upcoming flood on Brahmaputra, despite the existing agreement. The official statement of Beijing was that, well, we are having some maintenance projects, so data could not be shared. But there are some theories, guesses that it was a kind of retaliation after the Doklam crisis, because it happened soon afterwards, barely a few weeks after the Doklam crisis was resolved. Another case, there was some a spike in pollution in one of the rivers, which are the tributary rivers to Brahmaputra, also in Arunachal Pradesh. Indian side asked the Chinese side what happened over there, what is the source of this spike in the pollution in the river, and China reacted in such a way: we would not pollute these rivers because it is our territory. So you can see this logic, and you can see that we have various dimensions and various spheres where China can actually be putting more and more pressure on India. It's not just about the border itself, it's also about the vast border areas or borderlands, right? So that also includes, for example, water. So let me put maybe not a period, but a comma here, and I'm looking forward to further questions. Thank you.
No, those are excellent remarks, and I do agree with you about the Chinese reservation about not sharing the data. And I think in really serious situation, they could actually punish the neighbors in different ways. And I think that is what we need to be really aware of. And there, I think West and India could actually discuss a lot, and not only in terms of global gateway strategy, but also in terms about how the issues of those which are common for commonality of the human beings, issues which are for the ecological preservation, issues which are for the Himalayan valleys and for the people from belongs to the regions should be benefited, should be protected. And I think there we need a much more cohesive, united voice between EU, India, and West and India to raise some of these issues. And I think your point is very well taken. And we'll come back to you, Antonina, and just to share about your thoughts. How do you really think in future what EU and India in specific could do collaboratively in terms of, create pressure zone on China in terms of on the water sharing issues, or in terms of, affecting the environmental degradation in the Tibetan plateau or in the Himalayan valley, or in trying to build infrastructure in the areas which are going to affect the environment in the regions. Maybe there we could have a much more pointed remarks from you, which will be useful for the audience and for the larger international community to understand. Last but not least, we have Saroj. Saroj, being from Nepal, but stationed in Warsaw, trying to understand the Chinese dynamics in the Himalayan regions and how EU and the region could collaborate particularly. So maybe 6 to 7 minutes to you. Over to you, Saroj.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. Thank you so much for organizing such a great discussion. It's certainly you are right in the sense that it has been talked less and less about. So my previous speaker already touched upon most of the things that are to be talked about. So I think I'll try to keep this about Nepal only, so that I can give you some sort of generalizability on what kind of images that we can induct from Nepalese case study. So first, I also want to touch upon why it's happening. I think we started our departure point was mostly about what China is doing and how we can countering it. So I also want to touch upon a little bit on why it's happening, what sort of interest is associated with it, and then what is happening. And then later on, if time allows me, I'll also want to talk about a little bit on what can be done about it. So in case of Nepal, on the Nepalese side, from the era of King Mahendra and his personal issues with Gandhi family, he started to approach China. So it's Nepal who invited China intentionally in their territory for counterbalancing India. But later on, this counterbalancing India as a whole turned it into a counterbalancing dependency toward India. And then later on, it also, in a current state, it also remained, or it also can be seen as a perspective that it has been instrumentalized as a political agenda. So the one which is closer to China, the one which is closer to India, fights or screams against each other in Nepalese context. On the other hand, what China wants, or what China have interest in Nepal, as it started as some sort of minimizing the political threats, potential threats that China have with Tibetan refugees that are stationed in Nepal. Same goes to Central Asia, where they were motivated by minimizing the East Turkestan movement associated with Xinjiang. And then later on, after they convince political elites of Nepal that you should be always very aware about the one China policy, otherwise you will be offensive or this and that, they later started to approach Nepal or instrumentalize Nepal in terms of counterbalancing USA in Nepal. We have many instances where US was involved in a soft political stances, in hard, strong stances also in Nepal to counterbalancing China. So they started to use Nepal to counterbalancing US also. And later on, recently, especially after 2000 or so, they also start to instrumentalize Nepal to counterbalance India. I have a reason for it. My reason is all the things that is happening in Himalayan region is they know that if there can be a scenario where India counterbalance China perfectly, then they also want to engage India completely in a Himalayan region so that they have a more or less easier scenario in Indo-Pacific region also. This is also one of the interests that China have. That's my personal assessment. India's larger resources has been engaged in a Chinese border side, so that they have less attention and resources to spend on Indo-Pacific region. That is also one of. And recently, China is becoming more and more politically active entity. This is the new emergence of China's approach toward Nepal, that they are involving in the internal politics of Nepal also. 2 weeks ago, one of my friends who used to work with me in one of the newspaper in India wrote a tweet in Nepal, wrote a tweet about the airport that China is building and what sort of corruption or what sort of irregularities that it has. And the Chinese ambassador of Nepal started get into a fight with him in Twitter. So they are that much of particular about those things in Nepal. So this is just to give you some sort of impression on why it's happening. In terms of what they are doing in Nepal is they have lots of mega imagination. I would not say practical projects, but they have a mega imagination which has been going on since very long time, but hasn't been able to take a form of such things. Nepal got comparatively very close with China since 2015. It has to do with what happened between Nepal and India during 2015. And Nepal is one of the first countries which signed Belt and Road Initiative. And interestingly, when Nepal signed a Belt and Road Initiative, the agreements or the signing document says that they are going to do a 35 mega projects in Nepal, which later became 9. And now they are only working on 3 mega projects in Nepal. It also has to do with that's where I will do what can be done. It has to do with the internal policy of Nepal. So it's decreasing. Of course, China is getting more and more aggressive in terms of encroaching border and those things in northern Himalayas. But Nepal don't have a capacity or any mechanism to monitor what kind of activity China is really doing in northern. Because it's a very high Himalayan land, Nepal is absolutely not prepared to operate in those high lands. And then, and in terms of investment that China is doing, China is mostly interested on infrastructure project. Interestingly, these days, China is interested in projects to run in a southern border, which is closer to India. So this also should give us some sort of impression on China after the earthquake in 2015 built a school, and most of the schools were in down south. They were more interested in station in down south. They are working on lots of irrigation project in down south. They want to be more closer to India. And we simply know the reason that India is the only country that can counterbalance them in Nepal, for instance. That's another thing. And lots of projects that China is involved in is automatically nowadays getting controversial. especially after what happened in Sri Lanka, especially the medias, especially the strategic circle are very particular about what China is doing, how China is doing, what sort of implication it's going to be. And at the same time, China, if you see, since 1.5 years, China is also very particular about whether this project can be called a project under Belt and Road Initiative or not. They also want trying to distance most of the project from Belt and Road Initiative because they don't want to give an impression that's what happened in Sri Lanka can be happen in Nepal or any other country. That's my understanding. And what, in terms of what can be done, is might sound very harsh and strong. Only thing can be done is US, Europe can capacitate India. From my perspective, my understanding is that if there is any country which can counterbalance China in a Himalayan side, only country that is equipped to do or know how to do it is India. Lots of signing, lots of capacity building should be done between Europe and India, between US and India, because this, I was pretty fascinated by the title of this seminar that we are having today, China's Himalayan Hustle. I have done quite a lot of work on India's neighborhood policy, and Himalayan state strategy is the first ever official neighborhood policy that India started to have. So Himalayan state policy is very important for India. India's neighborhood policy, the departure point of neighborhood policy itself starts from the Himalayan states. From Nepal, that time Sikkim, pre-independent Sikkim, the Sikkim before 70s. So only countries that can do anything about China's rise in Himalayan region is India. So for me, it's very important for US, Europe to understand that only country is equipped to do this is India. Another factor is why I slightly touched about the Nepalese bureaucracy is quite strong in terms of accepting anything, is there comes the role of European Union. European Union is spending lots of money on capacity building, lots of money on promoting democracy or sustaining democracy. Comparatively, Nepal is a very new republic, which only became republic and stay in a very long transition period until 2015. So Nepal comparatively have a very, very, very immature democracy. So where comes European Union, where they can capacitate Nepal in terms of intacting or keep intact the policy of bureaucratic processes that Nepal, so that it's more and more difficult for Nepal to accept anything that China offers. Because I recently am writing a paper on Sri Lanka, strategic failure. So when you have a weak institution, it's easier for people like Rajapaksa to accept whatever China offer. So it's very important to keep institution functioning, functional institution, so that they cannot accept whatever China offer. So it's also very important for European Union, US to spend more and more time on strongholding democracies of Nepal, so that they remain some sort of vigilant in terms of accepting, colliding with Chinese interest in Nepal. So I'll stop there, and then we'll talk about it more in the Q&A round. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Saroj. Those are, again, interesting points. Strategic failure point from Sri Lankan experience is going to be a reference for many countries, but we'll come back to you more about what are the current Nepalese perception in terms of China's militarization of the Himalayan regions and all, if you could throw some lights on that. But there are three broad points coming back to all of you again. I'll start again with Mates. 3 points that I would like to invite your comments. One is the technological oriented infrastructural planning that the Chinese are doing. What we are seeing that not only there are militarization effort, but also they're building infrastructures which will give them a strategic edge in terms of monitoring the troops deployment from India side, also trying to monitor the activities of other countries' troops movement and their infrastructural capabilities. So how do you really see technological oriented infrastructural planning that the Chinese are building up in the Himalayan Valley? Do you think that is something where the world could create a pressure or could generate a lot of awareness where we could discuss these issues in the UN forums or in the EU parliament, so that these issues could be discussed in further details. Second is, I think the point what Thomas was mentioning about Russia, Pakistan, and North Korea, that the islands that the Chinese are building. To what extent the Chinese are able to build these alliances not only from a global perspective, but also on a local perspective, in terms of trying to control the Himalayan regions or the neighborhood regions? Do you really see that China, Russia, North Korea partnership trying to have a say on the Himalayan Valley? Or the Chinese would also go a further, further ahead in terms of building alliances with countries like Nepal, or with Pakistan they already have. But what about other countries like Bhutan and Bangladesh? How do you really see these alliances are building up? So if you could comment on some of these issues, and also have a look at the chat box for some of the comments, and you could comment freely on those questions that our participants have posed. Over to you, Mateus.
Thank you, Jagannath, and thanks to all the other panelists for very interesting remarks. Let me maybe tackle the Russia angle, because I think that's an important factor that we have to consider, not necessarily due to Russia's direct involvement in what's going on in the Himalayan region, but as a factor that impacts a lot of what we are talking about when it comes to China and its global activities, right? China's and Russia's partnership is, of course, of a growing concern for European countries, primarily because of China's tacit support for Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. And due to this, a lot of other Chinese activities globally are interpreted through this prism, as well as relations of other countries, not just China, with Russia is an important factor in how we interpret these relations today, right? And as we know, of course, India has a very complicated relationship with China. It's a potential ally, not just for the US, but also for Europe when it comes to dealing with a lot of the challenges posed by China, and vice versa. Europe and US are, of course, going to be an important partner for India to react to a lot of how China is asserting itself in India's neighborhood. But this has a flip side, I think, as well. We see that India is reluctant to condemn Russia over its war of aggression in Ukraine, right? And this warrants some question, right? How to or like why? To what extent can India expect that Europe would be aiding India in dealing with China, while India is not willing to help Europe in dealing with Russia, right? So I think this is something that will have to be tackled quite strongly in bilateral relations between Europe and India as a factor that impacts the willingness of one actor or the other actor in jointly reacting to what the other one finds as a point of contention in its regional security environment. And because of this, I think Russia is a very important factor in what we are discussing. There's also second element to that, right? China having a cordial relationship with Russia means that a large portion of its border is safe and secure, and China doesn't really need to pay attention to it, meaning it can allocate resources to dealing with all of the other territorial issues that China has along the other borders, not just with India, but also in the maritime borders in the East China Sea and South China Sea. So this is the Russia angle. When it comes to broader system of China's partnership in the region, I think we also need to include Iran in this discussion, not just Russia, Pakistan, and North Korea. China-Iran relations are increasingly worrisome for observers from Europe, I believe, and so this sort of I don't want to say alliance system, right? Because China doesn't really have alliances. These are partnerships, partnerships based on calculus of what are the interests and where they align, right? So this sort of four-way partnership aimed at jointly undermining the current international system is something that should be of worry for every country globally, to be honest, especially the small countries which base their security precisely on being able to rely on the existing international order based on observation of some international rules that we've all agreed upon. So let me maybe pause here and ask where to as well, who thinks maybe something along these lines as well when it comes to Russia and how it factors into these discussions.
Thank you. And I think your point about strategic partnership is good, but there is a case with North Korea. China is an alliance partner of North Korea, so we should not be in any doubt. But thank you very much for those interesting remarks. Jeff, you would like to pitch in and comment on some of these technological issues that the Chinese are bringing through their infrastructural advancement in the regions?
Well, if the much examined U.S.-China competitive relationship, it's very complicated, but where it is the most competitive, honestly, besides in kind of back and forth through diplomatic messaging, is in technological sector, both in supply chains, both as it relates to the industrial bases of each country, and the standardizations associated with critical and emerging tech like AI, quantum, advanced sensing, and things like this, which could theoretically be game changers, both economically, ecologically, and even strategically. So this is where the Quad, I saw that question come up in the chat. The Quad is not directly going to be involved in the actual dispute of the border between India and China, because the Quad does not, even though everyone talks about it being a strategic oriented effort, much of the progress and work is really done on kind of regional cohesion vis-a-vis economic and technological components, and then translating that into a tighter knit. Yes, there's a China angle tied to it, but the technological angle with the Quad does have ramifications, because what China is doing there is an indication, a sample, a test case of showing what happens if the Quad or India unilaterally, or the United States with its own domestic production, does not get into the similar processes of tying critical infrastructure to emerging tech, making it done in a financial system and in a supply chain that is open to more actors, because it also is an advertisement for how China operates, but also how much speed and efficiency it can have in its system because of its authoritarian processes. So India and the U.S., there's been a lot of evidence. You can point to Indus X in bilateral defense ties. There are joint ventures and joint incubation projects being developed in relation to the National Science Foundation here in the United States and local universities in the U.S. with Indian universities, so that joint patents are developed simultaneously, so that export controls and import barriers do not become a problem. They're jointly designed as a collective process. This is like the kind of thing that the Quad gets into it. So, and it does have a mechanism into a lot of the technological components tied to telecommunications, tied to the development of critical infrastructure, whether it be industrial projects like dams, roadways, and then secondary and tertiary industries tied to it that you see on the Chinese side of the disputed area. So that is where a lot of the competitions is there. The one thing I would pull back from is that while the U.S. And China, the U.S. and India very much are increasingly running in parallel, and from a kind of senior level point of view, from like Prime Minister Modi to President Biden, there's nothing but goodness and a lot of positive. There's still a lot of work to do on the working level within the Quad and bilaterally between the U.S. and India vis-a-vis the different structures they have. India's private sector is not as much a lead in how industrial policy and tech policy operates in India. And likewise, the government in the US sometimes struggles to catch up with what our private sector is doing. So there's a lot of these sorts of things. But I think the trend line here, given time, is you're seeing progress, you're seeing a maturation and a diversification. So in some ways, China's speed and China's economic kind of heft has kind of been its own worst enemy in a long way, because you see the EU and how it is responding to key investments in developing countries' infrastructure. Japan is getting more nimble, and then the US is kind of pushing heavily on the tech side. There's a lot of different factors that are trying to create a counterpoint to the one-size-fits-all model that China exports, and how they lock in, like other commenters have very effectively pointed out, from Sri Lanka to Pakistan and others in the region. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thomas?
Thank you very much. Maybe coming on 2 points. First, perhaps this was also partly a response to my statements on your part. When you talked about is China's relationship with Russia and North Korea relevant for the Himalayas, that's not necessarily how I meant it, but rather looking at China's neighborhood overall, its relationship with Russia enables greater Chinese influence in Central Asia. Its relationship with North Korea enables greater influence in East Asia, and its relationship with Pakistan enables a greater influence in South Asia. The second point I will comment on is something that a colleague brought up in the Q&A chat, and that's about raising an issue in the UN, and wouldn't Chinese representative disagree with the Indian legal position on where the border is. Now, of course, but my point wasn't about who has the stronger legal arguments on every facet of the border issue and where it should be, but rather on the legality and acceptance of the use of force, and under what circumstances this could happen. And it's certainly in cases that we've seen in Europe that have been mentioned, Russia's use of force in Ukraine, there is no grounds in the UN Charter that would justify that kind of use of force. And if something similar would happen in South Asia, then certainly it should be judged in the same way.
Thank you very much. Antonina, I'm sure you will be commenting on that questions which has come from Henrik. I think he has raised an issue about the flow of water, how the Chinese are controlling. So maybe you could comment on some of these issues. Yeah.
Absolutely, with pleasure. So basically, the situation is a little bit complicated, because it's not as simple that you will clearly simply turn off the tap on the water dam and the water will stop flowing. No, this does not work this way. It's a little bit more complicated. In Brahmaputra, in such a case, because it's estimated that only 20% of the water in Brahmaputra actually comes from those melting glaciers in Tibetan Plateau. The rest of water that actually gets to India comes from the rainfall, as well as other tributary rivers, right? So the Chinese cannot just dry up, the rest of the Brahmaputra stages or the whole length of the Brahmaputra River. However, again, in the times of dynamic climate changes, it's very difficult to predict to what extent actually they would be able to negatively affect all the water infrastructure in India, and of course the agricultural processes and so on and so forth. It's a little bit more clear on the Mekong River because of its geographical conditions. So indeed, on the Mekong River, the Chinese can literally turn off the tap and the impact will be much greater, right? And we already saw it in 2020-21 when the level of water on Mekong River dropped by 1 meter. 1 meter, you might say it's not that much on such a mighty river, but it was enough to disrupt agricultural activities, transportation, and basically made all the countries of Southeast Asia extremely concerned. The reason? Well, the Chinese claimed that they had to carry out some maintenance projects, 3-week-long maintenance projects in 21, for instance, and that is why without the prior warning, they turn off those taps on their dams on the Mekong. So we could really see in practice the impact of Chinese actions on their river dams. So we could see that the consequences are terrifying, and even more terrifying that their scale is very difficult to predict. So let me go back to your question, Jagannath, about possible solutions and what India can actually do, for example, with the EU countries. So let us not forget that India is not the only country which has the kind of environmental agenda, let's say, or narrative. The so-called Tibetan government in exile, after all, based in India, has a similar agenda or similar discourse. Actually, recently I've been looking into the statements and speeches of Dalai Lama regarding China's water projects and water pollution and environmental damage in the Tibetan plateau. And it's really interesting to see how, in such a smart way, Dalai Lama is in this case, more of a political rather than spiritual leader. He claims that Tibetan people should be given more authority in Tibet to take care of water resources because they know these territories best. So he doesn't claim openly that, oh, Tibet should be independent or anything like that. He doesn't even, in the first place, state that, oh, there are some problems with Tibetan autonomy within the PRC, but he's kind of wrapping it up in the environmental agenda, environmental narrative, right? So the whole world should care more about Tibet because environmental damage, environmental erosion in Tibet is something that will affect the whole world, right? After all, 47% of people depend on water resources that originate in the Tibetan plateau. So it's almost half of the global population. However, I think that it will be very dangerous for India to actually tighten up their narrative or wrap their narrative together with what Dalai Lama is saying, or in general, Tibetan government in exile, because of course, India would like to tackle this issue probably bilaterally with China without adding up the Tibetan context or opening another Pandora's box, if you will. However, what definitely India could do is to make this matter more international, more multilateral. We know that India is not very willing to go internationally, right? So India really likes to deal with things in a bilateral manner. Well, we also cannot forget that India did not sign the UN Convention on Protection and Use of Transboundary Watercourses and International Lakes of 1992. China did not sign this convention either. But what I'm trying to say is that perhaps to win the hearts and minds of global citizenry, India probably could try to be crystal clear itself in the first place. And let us not forget that India has been accused many times by its own downstream countries, so Bangladesh and Pakistan, of some very unfair practices when it comes to water sharing. Actually, a few years ago, when there was this terrible terrorist attack in Kashmir and many Indian soldiers died and the Indian government accused Pakistan of carrying it out, I believe it was the Minister of Water Resources who tweeted that actually India should stop sharing water with Pakistan and divert those water resources back to Jammu and Kashmir. So pretty much breaking the 1960 Indus Waters Treaty. Later on, Indian government had to clarify things that, of course, such thing could not happen. But again, we can see that even some members of, political elites in India or political leadership in India made these kind of threats, right? And tried to use water as a weapon and as a leverage to put pressure in different spheres, right? Which really makes this case, this example, well, it's a very good example that this thing can be very, very dangerous, of great consequences. And it's something that India, in my view, should really refrain from. So in the first place, India itself should show that it's crystal clear, maybe really think about signing this water treaty. After all, last year we had 5 new signatories. So this case is coming back. And there are new countries joining this treaty. So that might be one of the solutions, at least to repair India's image on the international stage.
Yeah. No, thank you. Again, very useful comments. Saroj, you have to add something more from the Nepal point of view?
Yes, so you
very
slightly
briefly, we'll go for another round. So very briefly, maybe.
Yes. So you talk about the technological infrastructure in a Himalayan region. It's already happening in Nepal. China have built a very, very high technological, supposedly weather monitored infrastructure in even Mount Everest already, Mount Everest Base Camp, in a second biggest, second highest mountain, Choyu also. So they are already developing it. And one thing we need to understand that is China have a much more technological superiority in Himalayan region. So they are already talking about the Trans Himalaya Railways project. They're already in past 10 years, China and Nepal already opened 3 new passway between China and India, China and Nepal. So this is already developing, and it's very severe. Maybe not necessarily for Nepal in the sense that, but China can instrumentalize these things against the great powers, against India, against US, against European Union, and thing. And talking about what we can do is, I think it's very simple. It's as simple as it is that India, US, EU need to spend more money on infrastructure. Why China is seeing much more in an advantage position here is China is throwing large sum of money to this Himalayan nation. And we talk about the democracy promotion, we talk about the human rights, we talk about this and that. Ultimately, for these countries, with infrastructure capabilities is very, very low. What it counts for them is a bridge. What they counts for them is a highway. What they counts for them is a hard infrastructure project. So there should be some sort of mechanism in terms of bringing in some more money in infrastructure. We know that European, yes, I'll add some. And okay. Then I just like to touch a small issue that you talk about, the possibility of forming alliances between China, Russia, and North Korea to do something in the Himalayan region. I think this, I have a very different perspective about this, that this is not a possible scenario for me. Because the thing is, like, I am monitoring closely China and Russia in Central Asia. Despite it looks like they cooperate, despite it looks like they are coming closer and closer, but their interests collide massively in Central Asia. So it's very unlikely that they will have a similar interest in a Himalayan region. In a broader spectrum, they may be cooperate here and there in terms of countering US, countering European Union, but forming some sort of alliances to have an organized approach in Himalayan state, it's very unlikely scenario for me. That's my personal assessment. So that's all from my side. And then if there is any questions that I need to add, concerns that I need to add, I will come back.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we are almost there in terms of time, but we'll just extend for 5 minutes just to go for one final round. And I'll invite all the panel members to just summarize their views, what India and EU should do in terms of raising the awareness about China's Himalayan hustle, maybe in one line or in a couple of minutes, particularly what India and EU should do, India and US should do. But there is a question for me about, do you think India should rethink in altering its neighborhood policy to build more trust among the Himalayan countries, especially with Nepal? I don't think there is anything wrong with India's neighborhood policy. In fact, if you see the current government's policy approach, it has always given a first priority to the neighbors. And therefore, in fact, when the Prime Minister Modi came to power in 2014, he introduced this fast neighborhood policy. But what essentially we have seen that most of the major powers, they struggle in terms of dealing with their neighbors. This is a universal story in world politics. Your neighborhood might not really be peaceful. Your neighborhood, it is not necessary, or it is not really always easy to, satisfy your neighbors. So therefore, India will have some difficulty in terms of dealing with all the smaller neighboring countries in the Himalayan regions and in the Indian Ocean regions. But from my point of view, I don't think there is a necessary to change or alter the neighborhood policy. What we need is to build more confidence, more networks, and probably trying to bring external actors that we are talking about in our foreign policy about Vasundhaya Kutumbakam. World is one family. So therefore, we need to invite West, we need to invite EU, we need to invite US to be a part of this, infrastructure building, human civilization, protection, and in terms of, building resilient infrastructure in the regions. I think that is what we need in terms of strengthening our connections with the neighborhood. But with this note, let me invite for a final remarks from all the panelists, maybe just 1 minute. You could look at the questions if you want to comment. There are some questions which we could ignore, but there are some relevant questions if you would like to answer very shortly, maybe in 1 minute or a couple of minutes. Over to you, Mathis, first.
Yeah, thanks, Jagannath. So let me maybe just wrap up with how to look at this from the EU perspective, because I don't dare to comment on India's neighborhood policy. But from the EU perspective, there still remains a lot of homeworks to be done, right? Global Gateway is still a project in making. So for it to have a higher relevance in the Himalayan region, as well as for India, EU still needs to clarify and come up with tangible ways how to move forward in the region, be it independently or in partnership with India or other countries in the region. Secondly, for EU and India to jointly kind of offset what is China's offer to the Himalayan countries, we need to have a better understanding of the needs of these countries, right? Because oftentimes it was for EU's activities were not focused on these hard infrastructure needs. So this is something that maybe EU needs to change its thinking on how development is approached, and that funding needs to be also allocated to these types of projects. And thirdly, there still needs to be, I think, involvement in promoting improvement of various governance issues, right? Because as I said in the very beginning, to put this as a merely a debt trap issue is too simplistic. Each recipient actor has a role to play, and when it comes to various manifestations of China's influence in how these other countries operate, it is oftentimes an result of various exploitation of various existing domestic gaps that are tied more closely to domestic governance issues rather than to foreign politics. And here, I think EU can still play a very instrumental role in closing some of these gaps, thereby minimizing ability of China, or for that matter, any other actor, to exploit these gaps, regardless of what are the pre-existing levels of economic exposure to China of these countries.
Thank you. Jeff, you want to pitch in?
I just wanted to thank everyone again. The only thing I would end with is the priority for the United States is the Indo-Pacific, of which South Asia comprehensively is a key component of. But the idea, and I understand the logic from the region, is I think the issue for the United States and for our regional partners is become more realistic about what the U.S. system provides in terms of certain types of infrastructural investment, private sector engagement, public-private partnerships. That's more the specialities of the U.S. versus large-scale, quick, massive infrastructure projects. China has that luxury, and the U.S. policy is not really going to coordinate towards we're going to chase kind of the rat around the room, so to speak. We're going to develop our own policy that's implementable, and every sovereign state has the right to choose China or the EU or the US as their partner, or India or who have you. But what we have a comparative advantage in, I think regional states need to be more aware of what those are and request, and the US needs to do a better job of communicating what we do well and offering that up.
Sure. Interesting. Thomas?
Thank you very much. Just to reiterate and add a couple notions, perhaps. So what could be done jointly could be to jointly invest in infrastructure projects in a way where Indian companies profit and European companies profit. This could be done not only in India, but also in third countries, including in the Himalayan region. Both India and the European side have satellite navigation systems and could contribute to awareness raising and transparency about what actually is happening on the ground. And on the diplomatic and multilateral side, there could be lots of trust building between India and the European Union, joint protection of the Charter of the United Nations, making it clear that disagreements have to be resolved through negotiations or judicial solutions and not the use of force, and also that there is a mutual trust in each other, and that each side should have more of a say in the institutions of the United Nations, including a permanent seat for India in the UN Security Council.
Yeah, interesting. Antonina?
Let me stress once again that India first should be crystal clear itself. Because it seems to me that some of the international foreign partners of India might be a little bit concerned that this technology, know-how, data that India is using to, let's say, protect itself from China can be used by India in its dispute with Pakistan, or can actually be actively used by India against Pakistan if any other skirmish or open conflict, open war with Pakistan starts. So I suppose this can be one of the concerns of foreign partners, and therefore India should show by all of its actions, including the cases that I've been mentioning, so water sharing, that India has clear intentions. Nothing will be used against other downstream countries or other neighboring countries, such as Pakistan, that it only has some sort of defense mechanism, let's say. And to that end, of course, India should also probably stress its concerns about the, human rights issues, for instance, right? So again and again, India should become a shining democracy, because that means that India is transparent, India is reliable, India is based on the rule of law, and that also increases trust of its democratic partners. And this is not only about image building. These are real actions, real bonds, real foundations that can be laid and developed to help India in the future.
Thank you. Saros?
Okay, so thank you very much for this opportunity. Just to conclude that, maybe I'll slightly conclude on India's neighborhood first policy. Yes, there is lots of willingness, lots of activities that India have done in neighborhood since 7 decades already. But there is a problem. It's incoherent, it's emotionally driven, and it's ad hoc. So India needs to work on these 3 things. it's very hard to map what kind of things or what kind of policy really India is adopting toward these small states. And in terms of what EU and India can do is, I think for me, from my observation, there is a bureaucratic hassle also. EU have their office in Nepal and EU have their office in India. And EU office in India do not have an intervention or any sort of activities they can do in EU in Nepal. They always have to coordinate with EU office in Nepal. So to avoid these bureaucratic hassles, maybe they can do, or maybe they can establish this sort of trilateral partnership between EU, Nepal, EU, India, and Indian government. So maybe if they can do like this, and it implies to all the Himalayan states nation, you have their setup in most of the, and then this is colliding with each other. So this, I think, really needs to be addressed in a future goal. So thank you so much.
No, thank you very much. I think those are interesting remarks. I'm sure our audiences, participants have been benefited, and we are going to put this recording in our website probably in a week's time, and then we'll stay in touch with you for as we proceed with this project further. But again, it has been an excellent afternoon discussing with all of you about China's Himalayan hustle and what the India and West could do together. And I think your observations and remarks are very pointed, very interesting, very debatable equally. But we'll get back to you in terms of probably preparing a report and get your feedback, further feedback. And also, we are looking forward for our future engagement in terms of inviting you to write, contribute to our study, and be a part of this project, interesting project. Again, thank you very much for this interesting panel and your interesting comments and participation. We really appreciate, and we really thank all of you to be with this ISDP panel, and we are looking forward to stay in touch with you. Have a good day, good evening, and have a good rest of the week and weekend ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Panda. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.